la vérité touche au réel.
Young Zizekians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Sbriglia.
Is it Elmalar?
Engaging the unconscious.
In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing Mediators.
Okay, hello everybody. It's the Vanishing Mediators. It's your host, Big Sig, aka Andrew, and Free Beer Tomorrow, Nick Castellucci, and we have a returning special guest with us, Dr. Todd McGowan, our favorite Hegelian Lacanian, author of many books such as Emancipation After Hegel, Enjoyment, Right and Left, and your newest one, right? The Racist Fantasy.
I think that's the newest. Yeah. I think they came out on the same day.
It's funny because I think the last time we had you on, you're like, I think that's right.
I said the same thing. Yeah.
But we're glad to have
people will think it's just the same thing playing again and again.
We're glad to have you back on, and we also I saw you last at the For They Know Not What They Do course.
That's right.
By Michael Downs. It was really good to have you there. Really good discussion on both ends. Great book.
Agreed. Yeah, it is it's funny. I was just writing a thing for, I don't know why they're doing this, but there's some compendium, this encyclopedic thing on Slavoj, and I was talking about his reading of The Conversation, and I forgot that he has a little discussion of conversation and For They Know What They Do, and then I just was reading around it, and it's just so good. I think it's really, and maybe is his best one. I don't know, but
I definitely like it.
Yeah.
So today we're going to be talking about a summary of Seminar 2 and kind of an intro, and kind of you could be our Virgil to our Dante from Seminar 3 as we get into the hell of psychosis.
Right. Yeah, because we're going into 3 right now. We thought this discussion would be kind of oriented towards, our entrance into 3, but also what to expect leaving 2.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, definitely.
So I think there's a shift in preoccupation, like what he's talking about, but I don't think that there's the kind of radical theoretical shift that happens between, say, 6 and 7, and then 7 and 8, and then 8. Like between those, like for 4 years or something, he really is changing his mind in a pretty radical way, and I don't think that really happens here. Although one of the things that he's honing down, I think that to me, the Seminar 2 is really the best seminar probably on symbolic order and big other. I think it really fleshes that out pretty well. And then Seminar 3 is really about what happens to a subject that doesn't really have that. And then how, so I think that's to me what's interesting about thinking about the two of them together, is that one's really focused on what makes someone neurotic, and then the other one is, well, what happens if you lack that anchoring point that everybody else, a very normal neurotic person, has. And I think that's the shift that he's going to undergo. And I mean, not shift, but the turn that he's going to make.
Right. No, that's pretty interesting. And yeah, like I feel like going into Seminar 3, I don't really see much of a shift. We still kind of get a little bit of the his schema L method, but what we get, I feel like, is like we start to talk about Saussure and the signifier and the signified. We don't really get too much of the structural linguistics per se, like we are used to in Seminar 2. Like we see in later Lacan, like middle Lacan, and then of course, in later Lacan, especially Seminar 17, when he starts to get into like what the S1 is. But we get like from Seminar 1 into 2, this word of the symbol, right, or the subject as S.
Right. You're right. That's there, but the notion of S1. He sort of has. I mean, when he talks about name of the father, he means S. So he's just going to refer to it in different. I think I've always thought it's the same concept. It's just named differently. So I think So I'm not sure that they're that much just. But I think what's interesting, I wonder if he given the seminar on psychosis much later, if he would have talked about the imaginary as much as he does, because that's basically a lot of the seminar, I think, is devoted to how the psychotic is stuck in the imaginary. And there isn't really, I think real for him, this is to me really interesting. I think real for him is still just reality in seminar 3. It's not this stumbling block of the symbolic, this impossible real. I think it's impossible. I don't think it yet has that status here. So that seems to me like, I wonder if he would have, and maybe there's a hint of this in seminar 23, which is way ahead of what you're talking about, but maybe there's a hint of how he would think about what it means not to have name of the father later in that seminar. But I think that seems to me like, I always have thought, well, wow, if he would have said this seminar much later, wouldn't the real have played a much more significant part in it? I think the answer is yes, it would have.
Yeah, no, yeah, definitely. I did have a few questions, just like Nick, on seminar 2, just for some clarification. I'll just say one, and Nick could take the lead off of this. But what is the difference? Because I've been reading the Acree version of the Purloined Letter and going off of the seminar 2. I think the seminar 2 one is obviously a lot easier to understand compared to the Acree one. But like, I really don't see a difference. And I know, like, in your Y theory episode, you talk about Derrida's criticism of it, but they almost seem to be like quite similar. Like, I don't see where.
I don't think the point is different. I don't think the point is different. I just think, just like you said, isn't it funny that the written version that he publishes is the more inaccessible one, and the one that he gives to the people that are in the inside circle is the more accessible one. It's to me, it's a striking reversal of, you know, how Aristotle distinguished, or people talking about Aristotle distinguish between the esoteric texts that are just for the insiders, and then the exoteric that's for the larger. And I just think it's funny that for Lacan it's totally reversed. Like, what's for the esoteric is easier and the exoteric is harder. So that's the only thing I think. But I do think that I don't think the idea is different, but I do think that I mean, the odd even game is not in the Acree, right? Like that, or
he mentions it a bit, but it's not.
I don't think it's in it, as much. And so that, I think that's pretty significant for the way he thinks that structure functions and creates gaps, right? Like, I think that's I think that's less. I mean, obviously it's still there, but I think that in the written version, it seems to me like his preoccupation is more with the idea of the letter and what's it mean to bear the letter,
right?
And I feel like that the spoken version is more. I could be wrong. I haven't looked at it recently, but it seems like the spoken version is more. The seminar 2 version is more concerned with the gap within that, the gap that's created once you start to symbolize something.
Yeah, that's true. And the movement of the letter, like, it always reaches its destination, and how it kind of changes within each person's hand. But I noticed that he actually, on the Acree version, he emphasizes more of the notion of compulsion repetition, which I don't think is present in the seminar 2 version. But like, I think he wants to like imply that it's a given, because he's been talking about repetition compulsion throughout the entire seminar.
Right. I mean, the whole seminar is really on beyond the pleasure principle, right? So I think that's I think that's probably right. He didn't feel the need to go into that.
So something that's been on my mind that I've been wanting to ask you about for a while now is sort of, you know, there is this lead up to the mature conceptualization of the real, maybe we could call it, that would be, I guess, the real of seminar 23 on. But I'm wondering if there is anything about, for instance, his playing around with cybernetics and the game of odds and evens, anything about that, you know, that he's experimenting with, that in a sense can be retained both for a later understanding of the unconscious, but also the real, because there's this kind of memory system, or like mnemonic system, that's going on there that I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure if he picks that up later on or not.
Yeah, I would say I think that's right. I think that that there's a anticipation of the real in the way that the gap functions in the like you certain things can't follow from others, right? Like certain impossibilities are created. I forget the number, like a gamma can't follow from a whatever it is, right? Like there's certain like once you group things in a certain way, you create both possibilities, but then you also create impossibilities. And I think that's always struck me as he's really talking about already in a way talking about the real, even though he doesn't call it that. So I think that's pretty. I think you're right about that. And it is interesting he doesn't go back to that in that same specific way. But I do think this notion that, I mean, he does say he said, when's the first time he says it? Maybe seminar 18, where he says the real is the impossible. So I think that idea that's already anticipated there. So I do think that you're right to see that connection. But it is interesting he doesn't go back to that exact structure. I don't think, in fact, I'm not sure that he ever does that, right? That he ever goes back and says, well, what I really was talking about here was, the only time I can think of is when he talks about the mirror stage in the anxiety seminar, and he basically rewrites it and says, actually, he doesn't say I was wrong. He just says, remember when I pointed out that there's always another holding the baby into the, well, you go back in mirror stage, it's not really there. So I wonder, he could have done that with this seminar and he didn't do it. So I think it's a good point that he's anticipating the real, but I wonder why he doesn't come back to that very odds and evens game, because I think it seems to me to illustrate the point that he'll want to make about the real later on, even in as early as seminar 11, right? Like that notion of the difference between automaton and 2K that he gets from Aristotle, that seems like that encounter is what you get in seminar 2. When there's this impossibility that you come up against. That seems a little bit like that 2K.
Well, yeah, because I remember reading Bruce Fink's famous introduction to Lacan, and he has an entire chapter that focuses on this recreational mathematics, and he has a kind of like preface to it that says, oh, you can skip parts of this, come back to it later. But at least for Bruce Fink, he seems to think that it's an essential lens for understanding the unconscious and the way that it works.
Right. No, I think that's right. And I think Bruce also has that, I mean, I don't know if it's in that section, but he has the great discussion of the coin flip. I think he has the best discussion of that I've ever read. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, I kind of want to just like piggyback off of Nick's question, because it makes me think now that we're talking about the distinction between impossible real and the real as reality in early Lacan. Don't you think that he kind of plays this out in seminar 2 with connecting all three of these games, which is not game, but the story of the Purloined Letter, the odds and evens game, and then even logical time, as like carrying on the same form in which like there's like a temporal moment, and there's these rules. In one instance, there's the changing of the letter based upon insistence. And then at that specific time of the glance, like then you get the time for comprehension in which hypotheses come about. But like even in these times where you create a chain of hypotheses of who the subject is, it's like it always leads to impossibility, right?
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think what he wants to say is that you miss that impossibility when you're stuck in this imaginary ego way of thinking, right? So I think that's what changes. Like later on, he'll say, well, you miss this encounter with the real, it's impossibility when you're stuck in your symbolic identity. So I think I always thought, well, it's kind of the same thinking. It just sort of the axis shifts from symbolic imaginary to symbolic real. I think that with symbolic playing the part that imaginary played earlier, and then real playing the part that symbolic played earlier. I think that seems to me which I think that fits in with it gives a kind of coherence to his thought that it otherwise it seems like, wow, there's this radical break, and he he never says, I'm going to change my mind about what this is. I was thinking about this, he even says about objet a, he gives a formula for fantasy in Seminar 6, and he hasn't yet invented the objet a. And then he talks about the same formula later on, and he goes, back when I talked about the relation to the objet a, I'm like, well, no, you didn't even, I mean, it was just the imaginary other then. So I think that's a pretty important, like he sort of plays fast and loose, but I think in this case, there is more continuity, and he could have even formulated that. Like he could have said, like, what I used to talk about in terms of this one way, now I'm talking about in this other term.
Right. That's good. Yeah, and that's like kind of like what I was going to lead up to, because you pointed out, it's like, no, you lose the impossible real as soon as you're caught in your symbolic identity, because it's like in the logical time essay, it's that each person thinks of themselves as the subject A, and it's like when they leave out the door simultaneously and they look, that's where like they begin to doubt. But then like when they stop, then the others stop. So it's like there is that impossibility, but there's always this like moment of hesitation to like identify with your symbolic imaginary identity. Thus you lose like the encounter with that impossibility.
Right. You miss it, and then you miss getting out of the prison. Right. But I think it's fascinating that getting out of the prison is equated with encountering the real. I mean, if you moved it to the later, like the scheme of the later seminars, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Having encounter with the real.
And the last thing I'll just want to add to that is because like it's always been a fascinating thing, because like you would think that the real is not present in there, like the real par excellence, but Mikey and I talked about this, but there's a book by I think his name is Chen-Ying Wang, who talks about like subjectivity in time, and he says like the only thing that's missing in Lacan in that point in time is the real. So he talks about real time, but I just think like, well, when you look at it further, there is a sort of impossible real.
Right. I agree. Like or something like a kairos that breaks the chronology. Right. Totally agree.
Todd, what do you think of how, he frames the movement of the death drive seemingly like solely within the symbolic order, and he always places the emphasis on this insistence, but it feels like there's a kind of, he bumps up against a sort of ambiguity that he himself is kind of struggling with, because maybe he doesn't have the most developed notion of the real at that point, it seems like, and he keeps going back to this insistence of the symbolic. We would call it the signifier now, but this continuation of, I guess it's like the reappearance of the sort of remainder that wants to be symbolized. But then I was reading recently, I forget which chapter it is, of Sublime Object, where Zizek is sort of like periodizing the real throughout Lacan's oeuvre, and it's like as if the stumbling block or the kind of subversion of the entire structure at first takes place like solely within the symbolic, but then it's as if the symbolic, at least in the unconscious, becomes sort of in line with the pleasure principle, and the real kind of attacks it from without.
I think that's right.
So,
I think it's right. And I think you can even think of it in terms of the relationship between death drive and pleasure principle, right? Like I think in Seminar 2, pleasure principle is imaginary, and the repetition of the symbolic is death drive, right? And so and then later it will be that the symbolic structure is pleasure principle, and the real, this interruption of the real that can't be, this impossibility you can't get around, that's death drive. So I think there is this shift, but I do think it's a pretty perspicacious point that you're making, that it doesn't quite fit theoretically, and he doesn't even, I don't think he ever articulates clearly what the source of the repetition in the symbolic is. Like, what is it that I mean, it's probably what you're suggested. Like we encounter new phenomenon, we attach a signifier to them, and then they get caught up. But it's not really it's not exactly clear to me. Like it's much clearer to me later what how the encounter with the real is structured around repetition, right? That seems very easy to understand. But but the symbolic thing, it's not, I think you're right. Like there's a gap there in his reasoning, even about how repetition and drive is connected to the symbolic, other than just this drive to signify everything.
Right. It seems like there's a kind of dubious role that the superego plays here, but he only mentions it maybe 3-4 times throughout like 1 or 2, but it's very ambiguous when he brings it up. But he says, there's the lecture in 1 where he's talking about not the wolf man, but the wolf child, right? It like has this signifier that keeps going back to, which sort of it has something to do with this sort of insistence, but also the law, but also the fact that he's bereft of a language. So it's like he's reliant on this one signifier, but it feels like something Lacan's working out and hasn't fully developed.
Because I forget which of the first 2 he says this, but he says the superego is the law insofar as it's not understood, right? Like that, I think that idea is, that seems to me consistent with what he would say later, when there's only one thing that commands enjoyment, that's the superego. That's seminar 20. So that law is insofar as it's not understood, that seems to me to fit right along with that, because I think what you're getting at is that the superego represents our libidinal attachment to law. I mean, that's Slavoj has made his intellectual bread and butter of that, right? That idea that there's this superegoic attachment to the authority, which manifests itself in whatever, right? Like in the way that we obey even when we know better, or even when we're not invested in what we're commanded to do, we obey. Why do we do that? Because there's this attachment, superegoic attachment, which is later on, I think Lacan thinks it's real, but even here he says it's something that's not understood. So I think that, again, that superego part is another way, just like the death drive, that's pushing or aiming at what he'll later call the real.
I think he says that when he brings up, and it's funny because it seems like Lacan rarely does this, but one of his own patients, his own case study of the patient who is, well, from a culturally speaking Islamic background, but has a kind of secular outlook, but his symptom is concentrated in this pain that he has in his hand, Lacan connects with the symbolic law in Islam, and the fact that this man's father was at one point considered a thief. And I think he says something to that effect. It's like, but he is suffering this pain insofar as it's almost a punishment for misrecognizing the law.
Right.
And that's very, very fascinating, confusing, and kind of difficult to disentangle.
Yeah, I know. I think I think you have it exactly right. Like the superego punishes for the failure to understand, but the failure to understand is written into the law itself, right? So there's no way to properly understand the law, which is, I think there's already, you can see the space between Lacan and Althusser, even though Althusser modeled his notion of ideological interpolation on Lacan, so it's an irony. But I think that idea of, for Lacan, for Althusser, the law interpolates us even when we fail, right? Even when I think it's the cop yelling at me, he's really yelling at you, and I respond. So there's a failure, there's a gap there, but it's still, that's how ideological interpolation works. For Lacan, I think it's the opposite. Like there's a space between, like that fact that we're missing the law is a part where the law it's not working out right, but that can create the possibility of breaking from the law, or it can create this libidinal attachment to it through when the superego is fully developed, right, or it's in force. So I think for Althusser, that's the way that things close down. But I think for Althusser, for Lacan, that's the point of opening, like where you can there's two roads you can go by, right? That you can either go toward like superegoic attachment, or you have the possibility of not accepting this hail of the law, or of whatever the figure of authority is.
I really, really like that. And like, that's kind of like tying into like what I was trying to, what I want to talk about. Cause like this emphasis of like the failure to be interpolated into the law, but yet, as you said, this like egoic libidinal attachment to it. It's like there's still an indivisible remainder, right?
Right.
I think it's something that Zizek says. I know Matthew Fleespader is a big proponent of this as well. And then Madame Delard talks about like in his criticism of Althusser, like there's like we have the psychoanalytic subject, which is the failed interpolation. And I want to know if, because there's something really interesting that he talks about in Seminar 2, and he ties it in with the Meno, something about you learn from error. And it's like, well, is this error tied to the failure to interpolate, or is it really the error from the superego? Because he says that the superego kind of moves from this insistence of ignorance or just failure to learn. And Nick told me that I should bring this joke up, but he talks about how the death drive is similar to like the joke about the idiot boy who walks into a funeral and he says many happy returns, and then they beat him over the head and they say, you don't say that, you say may God rest his soul. And so then he goes to the wedding and he says, may God rest his soul. Yeah.
That's pretty great. Yeah. Yeah. I think that you're right to say that is that moment of failure of interpolation is also the point at which we can be really attached. But in the example of the person that gets the things wrong, it also is a point of opening, right? Like that person doesn't have the superegoic, they might be psychotic, whatever, but they also don't have the superegoic attachment to the law, right? Like they don't read that there's always a misreading involved, even in the most successful reading. So I think that's I think this seems to me something that remains constant in Lacan all along. And I think it's really central to what he thinks, that there is the law makes some, or the authority makes some demand of us, right? And and then our desire develops in response to that demand. And so neurosis is to hew too close to the demand itself, but desire is the interpretation of the other's desire, right? So it's not, I think it's so great that there's no initial desire, and there's no initial desire of the other that gets imposed on us. Instead, there's this desire of the other that's there. The demand is imposed on us. Behind it is some desire. The other doesn't even know, because they're not the master of their own desire. Mm-hmm. And then we try to interpret that, and then we come up with our own desire, and it's always wrong, because the other doesn't even know what it wants when it demands. Like I mean, it's evident in, like, when a teacher says, like, I'm looking for this, and or better, when you're leading a class and you ask a question. I remember a couple of students said to me once, look, just give us a lecture telling us what is the right answer. Don't go through this thing of asking the question. And I said, I don't know really what I think or want until you respond in a certain way to my demand for an answer, right? So I think that's how desire functions, and that, I think, that's about this gap between the demand of the command of the law and then the response of the subject, and that's why it can go either way.
Right. I'm also thinking of something too that's kind of funny. Maybe it could be similar to this episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Larry David's in therapy and he's telling him about a dream, and he's like, yeah, I was like in heaven, I was promised like 74 virgins, but I counted it all and there was one missing, and I'm trying to find the missing one. And the therapist is trying to interpret it, and he's like, why is it that your couch looks more comfortable than mine? And he's like, this couch is god awful, but yours is good. I should take you couch shopping one of these days. And he like finds a fault in his desire, but tries to understand it. Right.
That's pretty funny, man. That's really great. That's exactly the thing. I think that's a perfect illustration.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that could lead us into the topic of ego psychology there, because it's like, I remember that episode, it's Bryan Cranston, he's kind of he's frustrated by the fact that Larry David is so fixated on this remainder, but maybe if he had a psychoanalyst, he'd be able
Right.
to respond to that better. But do you think that in these early seminars, I believe you said in your Why Theory episode on seminar 2 that Lacan's somewhat mired in this struggle against ego psychology, and he is constantly going back to it because maybe he wants to, like, one, sort of establish himself as psychoanalytic maverick in his own right, but also because he wants to very, like, carefully differentiate what he interprets as what Freud's doing from some of his descendants. But do you think it at all takes away from what he's doing? Also because he's very much like, he doesn't have the fully developed lexicon that he's going to work with later on, which I think is kind of interesting because we get to see some of the seeds of what he's going to be doing later on within the kind of more Freudian vocabulary, but sometimes it feels like he's holding back almost.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. I often have to remind myself that he's already in his mid-50s, so he's, even though you're right, like we would say, oh, it's kind of immature Lacan, he hasn't yet developed this, but he's an old, he's as old as me, he's even older than me. So he's an old guy. So I think that middle-aged guy. So I think that I've always found that really fascinating, that by the time Freud was his age, he had fully worked out his theory. So I think, although 59, when's Beyond the Pleasure Principle is a late turn. So maybe that's not true. Maybe like the most important development for Freud comes after that age. But I think that what you're saying is really good, that you're sort of seeing everything in embryo here, not yet. It's on the sketchboard and but about the ego psychology thing, I think that I guess I always felt like that detracted more from the écrit than it did from the seminars, because the écrit, I think the first 90% of the, up till subversion of the subject, it's basically a fight, or which is first, convex, I think subversion of subjects first. Almost up to that point, it's just about it, they're all just about the struggle against ego psychology. And I feel like that really, in the case of the écrit, I feel like that obsession detracted from what he could be articulating. I guess I still like seminar 2 because I think it does, for the reasons we've already talked about, that it kind of anticipates and maybe articulates what the real is in a clearer way than when it would be named the real. So I think that it doesn't bother me as much in these, although I do think it's evident. I mean, you can't read it and not say, wow, it's a hobby horse of his when in this. I mean, by seminar 3, that kind of diminishes. I think it already diminishes.
Right. And so in seminar 2, one of the emphasis the beginning is Freud's Copernican revolution, and we also grapple with his little criticism of the cogito, and he talks about how, like, go to your local dentist to learn about the cogito.
Right.
But it's like right here he wants us to reformulate what psychoanalysis has to deal with when we talk about the subject, like a speaking subject, something that's decentered, and this somehow has to deal with Freud's Copernican revolution. So I'm curious, like, what is your take on that? And does this also, like, have to deal with Lacan's, like, formalization of it in these, like, schemas, but also his insistence on constantly revising them because he doesn't want to end up like Leclerc's little error and becoming a little idolater of the subject, right? Always trying to localize it, because I think the point is that the subject of the unconscious is non-local, right? It's not realizable.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that is, so you're right to link it to the Copernican revolution where we're displaced, right? I think that's what he likes, that idea of displacement. I think the attack on Descartes is quite unfair, actually, because obviously Descartes privileges consciousness over, he has no idea, the unconscious, you don't know what that is. But the meditations what is it? What begins with? Discourse on method begins with the idea of displacement, right? Like and Descartes himself was a displaced guy. He never was. He spent more time out of France than in France. So he's constantly on the. Even died when in Sweden. So I think that I think that's I think that, and I think the very notion of the cogito is an idea of there's this subject that can't be there's something different than what can be placed. This I think is not reducible to the place that it comes from. And I think that's really already kind of anticipating what Lacan would say. So I think he could have, and Ticklish Subject, Slavoj's book, is really about this, about the redeeming Cartesian subjectivity. And I think he would say this too, that Lacan could have gone down that route already, and he just didn't, because he wanted to, I guess for him, the privileging of consciousness is its original sin in Descartes. It can't be forgiven. And I think it detracts from that. He can't see in that, because of that privilege. He can't see the displacement or the uprootedness that you get in Freud.
Right. And so like the whole point of the subject being displaced is that, like, well, it's because of language, right? When we're admitted to language, like that's what makes us speaking subjects. But also, I mean, I don't think he'll say this in the early essays, or the early seminars, but split subjects, right?
Right, exactly.
But
exactly.
For now, like we're displaced. We're not the masters of our own house. But I guess the only thing I'll add is, like, well, because of that, where do we find the subject then? Because this is kind of like something like, yeah, like we could like infer looking at the later seminars, but like for now, like in this seminar, it's like he says this thing that the subject and the ego are in this sort of impasse or intersection.
Yeah.
Especially when in the chapter of Irma's injection, he wants to give a relation between the subject and the ego, but also how they're not the same. And like in the dream, all these different people that Freud is encountering are like alter egos, right? But then there's this point where I guess you could say he can't account for himself as an ego, as an alter ego subject.
Right. It's the when he gets he's down the bottom of her throat, right? And then he immediately creates a symbol that then symbolizes. I mean, that's another one, Nick, where you would say like, wow, he's really anticipating what the notion of an encounter with the real would be. With the and subsequent people like Joan Kopchak have talked about that dream in precisely those terms. So I think that there's a way that he's already anticipating that. But I think that that's right. That subjectivity. I think it's split between the subject. I think it always will be split between the subject of the enunciation and the subject of the enunciated content. But here, that's kind of a divide between symbolic structure and imaginary, right? Like I think you can map that on to what this split in the subject is here. And then later it would be the subjectivity, the abyss of subjectivity, and then the symbolic identity that you have.
Yeah, I just wanted to take it back just briefly to Descartes and the cogito. And it seems to me like what he's doing is in part just Slavoj is doing the same thing in the Ticklish Subject, as you mentioned, sort of resuscitating the cogito, maybe contra the popular sort of structuralist post-linguistic turn attitude, especially Heidegger's critique of Cartesianism and everything, and trying to
right. I think that's right. Like
back.
I think you're exactly right on that. And I think this is a place where later he'll be even more at pains to do this, but he's trying to distinguish himself from Heidegger for sure, and from other thinkers. And I think when he says this sits in seminar too, when he says one never gets beyond certain fundamental thinkers, and he names Descartes, I think he says Descartes, Hegel, Marx or something. So, but he definitely says Descartes. So I think I think you're right about that. He's, in a way, even though there's a critique of Descartes for not knowing that, or not being able to recognize that in unconscious forms, or not realizing that when you say I think, therefore I am, you have to say it within language. I mean, that's his basic critique here. And I think that even though he does that, he's still, you're right, really resuscitating that Cartesian idea of Cartesian subjectivity, specifically against Heidegger, right? I think because the other people that are critical of it haven't yet been critical of it, right? Like, so like Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Derrida, like they haven't done any. I mean, this comes before them. So it's maybe a critique of them of all the left, but they're not there. So I think it has to be Heidegger that's envisioned by that critique. I think you're right about that.
So, okay, just very simple question then, because he has this really interesting lecture that I found difficult because of the metaphor in it of the camera, but it's a materialist definition of the phenomenon of consciousness. So we know Lacan is a thinker of the unconscious, but like, in your opinion, what is, or at least at this stage, what is consciousness then for Lacan?
Yeah, I think he's trying to say that consciousness is just a machine, right? Like, I think that's the thing that he wants to, and this I think is actually, it's pretty clear who the target of this is, right? Even though he doesn't say who it is, but I think it's Jean-Paul Sartre is the target, right? Like that, because for Sartre, consciousness is everything. Like consciousness is we're free because of our consciousness. And I think when he does that whole thing with the camera, I just think this is it's an utter attack on Sartre, because I think he feels it's not even it can't be a rivalry, because no one really knew who Lacan was, and Sartre never talks about him. But I think he feels a real like he wants to that's somebody he wants to separate himself from. And I think that the camera thing, I agree. I think it's a harder thing to read than its point is worth being hard. It's like you're reading Force of Understanding from Hegel, where, okay, there's a real reason why that has to be hard. But here, his point is really just, okay, consciousness functions like in a mechanical way, and it's not the site of our freedom, right? I think, he doesn't talk about freedom that much, but it's only in a critical way. But I think that one thing that he's trying to do is say, if we have freedom, it's more on the side of the unconscious than conscious decisions.
Right. Yeah. I really like that, especially like that's something that like Slavoj would kind of take on, like freedom of the.
Yeah, I think actually his new book is just called Freedom. So it's not out yet, but I think this is going to be a main thing. Yeah. So,
right. Yeah, and it's
a little
just
upsetting to me, because I have a book in my little folder called Freedom. It's, there's only like 200 pages of it, but so I'll have to call it. I don't have to change anything, but I'll have to call it something else.
I think for me, I want to transition into if it's all right with Nick, transition into questions concerning Seminar 3. And I know you're a big fan of the quilting point, so let's just get a good summary of like what exactly is Lacan doing in this one, and why the emphasis on the quilting point, especially in a seminar that's dedicated to psychosis. And from a clinical standpoint, the transference is totally different from an obsessional or hysteric compared to a psychotic. And it's something that you would do, at least from my understanding, in a typical neurotic subject.
It's something you would do. What would you
like
do?
like as a stopping point in a neurotic?
Oh, right. The quilting point. Right.
Yeah,
You would still quilt for a neurotic. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, I think that's really, in a way, isn't the quilting point a concept that applies more to neurosis than to psychosis in terms of psychoanalytic practice? I think that's right. And he has this great, I love that later seminar where he says, without the quilting point, you have a lot of roads, but no highway that's going right. And I think that to me really makes things clear, because if you look at a map or you want to orient yourself, you need the highway to orient yourself. Otherwise, you're just lost on all these back roads. And I think that to me is the real thing, like this way of this fundamental this orientation that the psychotic doesn't have. But he doesn't say that what the what the analysts can do is just quilt the right away for the psychotic, right? Like you have to work to that point. Although that is, I think that's his idea of how you treat psychosis. And that's the one thing that he differed from Freud about. Like for a lot of people, that was Lacan's big innovation, was that people that are practitioners, that he thought you could treat psychosis, and Freud was just, he threw up his hands. He's like, there's no possibility for transference. And Lacan thinks that, no, wait, just like you have to get the obsessive to become hystericized in order to enter into psychoanalysis, you can do a similar process with psychosis through creating these ersatz figures for the name of the father. And I think that's the one thing that this seminar does, is it equates quilting point and name of the father, or I think is paternal metaphor. Does that? I think he uses that terminology here. But then I've always found fascinating that quilting point completely vanishes theoretically from anything that he talks about, right? He never, the slight mention is in the Subversion of the Subject essay, where he equates quilting point with a point on the graph, but that's the only time.
Right. And I was listening to Danny Novus's interview that Daniel Tech gave to with Danny Novus on the new the new biography that Novus is
He's
making.
writing, yeah.
And
exciting.
The variable length session and the quilting point was something that he believed was innovative because it embodies what he early called dialectical psychoanalysis, right? And so, like, I think that's the whole point of like these punctual marks, which you would stop at, and then you would continue on in a sort of thought and motion to kind of.
You think he's right? He's right about the short session. I don't think he's right. I think
Danny Novus or
no, Lacan.
Lacan. I mean, I don't know. I mean, my analyst like he's kind of like free about that. He doesn't really focus too much on that. So
I just think, like, isn't the idea that, like, I think he's right that if you know when the thing, you're going to play out the string until you get, but can you avoid that just by stopping at a certain? I'm not sure you can, because the psyche of the analyst will take into account that you could stop at any point, right? So I'm not sure that I've always found, I was just thinking about this today, actually. It strikes me as a very anti-Hegelian idea, the short session, because for Hegel, when you cut things off short, you actually miss the contradiction. And it's only when you play things out to this, what he would call the absolute, right, that the contradiction becomes, the necessity of the contradiction becomes evident. If you just make a bare statement of identity, like I'm an American, it doesn't seem like that's contradictory at all. It's just like, I am American. That's just A equals it. Like, that's what I am. But I think if you so I wonder if I just was wondering about that, what you thought about that, because I've always been, I mean, a lot. It's a site. It's the reason why he was thrown out of the IPA, right? Like, for a very practical. It wasn't this like great theoretical dispute. It was just practical. They thought he's just stealing money from his patients, and that's a bad idea.
Right.
So, I don't know. I mean, I've always thought it was a little slightly unethical from that perspective, but I wonder about it theoretically too. I'm not sure if I and maybe also about the idea of the quilting point as like, is it? I mean, obviously there that I like the concept a lot, that there has to be a stopping point, but what is like stopping it short? I wonder if that is a way of maybe avoiding a certain realization that comes with the totality of the structure, whereas letting it play out.
Right.
I guess he would just say, look, sorry, 50 minutes is an arbitrary endpoint. It's not the same thing as Hegelian absolute, like working a thing out to its end.
Right. Yeah, because it makes sense to make the session longer than 50 minutes, but like I could see what you're saying about cutting it short, in which you miss the fact that there could be a play out of of the free assistance.
What if this session, what if it, like, this would be completely anti-capitalist, right? Because you would never make any money. But what if the rule was, no, you have to go on associating, and then they're going to stop sometime after an hour, and you never know when it's going to be.
Yeah.
So it might be, it might be 3 hours, it might be 2.5. So, I mean, no one would ever do that because it's not a really appealing thing. And people would be reluctant to go into psychoanalysis.
Oh,
but I think that
absolutely.
would be the Hegelian, something like a Hegelian model for it.
Oh yeah, it's so exhaustive to talk for more than 50 minutes.
It's terrible. I know. I remember when I was doing, I'm like, are we, oh my God, can we be done?
But I do think, like, as far as a theoretical, like, quilting point is a good concept, especially I think it's chapter 1 in For They Know Not What They Do. Look, Zizek says that the quilting point for the ideology of Nazi totalitarianism was figured into the Jew, right? And anti-Semitism, right? And so I thought that was really interesting when you look at, like, the history.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I the only thing that I like to just make a distinction about is the distinction between this master signifier, that what he'll later call master signifier, that has no signified, and then the quilting point that brings everything together. I think Lacan doesn't distinguish them at all in Seminar 3 at all. But I think that would be I think it's important to distinguish those two things. Like, there's a difference between, to come back to Slavoy's example of the Jew, like, there's a difference between German, like that signifier German, which is just a nonsensical signifier, and then the signifier Jew. And one starts the symbolic structure, and the other puts a provisional end to it. So I think that I just think I would want to distinguish between those two things in a way that Lacan doesn't.
As much as I love For They Know Not What They Do, I didn't get a clear idea from, I think it's in the first chapter, what the exact distinction between.
Well, he doesn't make a distinction, Nick. That's why you didn't get a clear idea.
Yeah.
No.
It's still a controversial issue. It's a sticking point.
Right. Because, I mean, if he's being true to Lacan, he's right not to make a distinction, because Lacan never does it. But I think by the time he develops the notion of, I mean, if you link master signifier to the name of the father, he's already developed that notion. But he never says, wait, quilting point's a different thing. And he just says there are more quilting points than there are there. The name of the father is singular, and then there are multiple possibilities of a quilting point, right? That's the only distinction that he makes in this seminar. So I think Slavoj is in a sense right to not make the distinction if your goal is to be true to Lacan.
One of the things that's always kind of troubled me about the concept of the master signifiers, it seems like in its kind of political valence, it means something very different from what it means in psychoanalysis, in the sense of like accepting a new metaphor. You have a new master signifier that somehow, structures your unconscious.
Right.
But if, like, in some of the examples that, like Zizek uses, it's like, well, America is a master signifier,
right.
But then it's hard for me to translate that.
That's true.
Psychoanalysis. Does that make sense?
True.
Like, do you see what I'm saying? So I feel like there might be some slippage there almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so you could say, well, there's a failure to translate the concept out of analysis. I think the failure is more on the other side. Like, I think I agree with Slavoj's way of thinking about that politically, but I don't think the goal of analysis can be this creation of a new like a new master signifier. That seems to, because I think if you think about it in political terms, the wrongness of it becomes very apparent, right? Like, it becomes like, I mean, one could even say, well, the problem with the whole communist experiment in the 20th century was they created a new master signifier that was just as horrible as the one that they broke out, maybe even worse, right? So I think that shouldn't be thought of as the goal, like finding that seems to be a problematic goal in the first place, which is why I think it would have been interesting if he would have sustained the idea of quilting point, and then what the difference is. Like, what if let's just take the German Jew example. Like, what if you quilted German differently? Like, you didn't quilt it with the figure of the Jew, and thus you feel secure in your German identity. But if you quilted it with whatever, like loss, or I mean, that's too abstract, but you know what I mean? Like something that's less securing of your identity and something that more puts your identity into question. I think that seems to me to be a way you could envision how analysis goes rather than finding this new signifier to attach yourself to.
Maybe it's a mistake on my part, like conflating the two, because again, thinking back to Fink and his idea of this sort of like new metaphor.
Right. No, I don't think you're
master
wrong.
Signifier necessarily. I don't know.
No, right. I know it's not, but I do think there's something to that. And there are people that, like Fabio Vighi in his book on Slavoj, he does say that the goal of political struggle is to create a new master signifier. And that seems to me not right. Like, I don't think that. And I think that's, again, I mean, I think, Fink, he's not, I mean, I think as a reader of Lacan, he's amazing, but I think he's not a leftist political, I mean, he'd be the first to say this, he's not a leftist political thinker. So I think he's not as concerned with that dimension as someone like Slavoj is. And he doesn't really care if psychoanalysis creates someone who's a capitalist subject. That just he doesn't care about that. But I think for me, if psychoanalysis does that, it might as well be ego psychology. I just don't care about it, right? Like I wouldn't want to invest myself in it. So I think that's an important. I think that like this notion of what that new signifier is and its status is really important. It is really important because if that new signifier is a new master signifier that you're invested in, then I think that's got a whole boatload of problems attached to it.
Yeah, like would it really be something you would articulate, or would it be something inarticulable in a sense?
Right.
My new master signifier is it went from America, now it's Mexico. I don't know,
right. Or God, or like it was the Catholic Church, now it's some form of Protestantism, whatever, right? Like that seems. Which actually would be, that'd be interesting.
Because Nick did bring up a good point, because I'm reading Seminar 17 with a Lacan group, lectures on Lacan. I don't know if you know Sam McCormick.
I think I do know him. Yeah.
Good dude. But yeah, like he brings up this notion of like you have S1 as the unary trait, and then and then like as Nick brought up, like this S1 that comes about through, I guess, the goal of creating new metaphors, something of difference. And Sam used this example of like, I have my unary trait of the S1 in which I was born and it was given to me, my name, but over time I could choose to develop a new S1 and maybe I want to be called Gerard. Like that's my new S1.
Yeah. What do you think of that?
Like I'm just very confused about it, because like obviously it's not the fact of like, hey, one day I just feel like changing my S1 to this. It's like it would have to be something that's like done over time. But like the S1, like I don't know, to me it's like the S1 isn't just there. It's like something like, and again, maybe this goes back to the quilting point, and also something that Michael Downs said, that you said that like we shouldn't think of like the signifiers as contained in this unconscious, but rather it's like through the movement of speech, we get these semiotic gaps in which the unconscious is located.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think that is.
Did you say that? Because you said that's like something that.
Yeah, I did say that. I mean, I can't remember obviously if I exactly said that, but something I would say that. That sounds like something I would say, and I think it does. It ties to what Nick, what we were talking about, the Seminar 2 discussion, right? Like that it's precisely the unconscious is in the gap. It's not in just the symbolic structure itself. It's in the gaps of the symbolic structure. I think that's a really important point. And I think Lacan often gets ruined. He says the unconscious is structured like a language. I think people say, oh, it's just this linguistic thing behind us. I think that is wrong. And I think like, I'm not that. So I know quite a few people that have changed their names. And I just think I'm sorry. I mean, this includes my own brother. I just think it's kind of dumb. Like, I just think it's because the whole, it's not psychoanalytically. I don't see anything psychoanalytic in that, because I think the whole point of psychoanalysis is to recognize the stupidity of the signifier, especially the master signifier, right? Like, especially S1, it is the stupid signifier. So and your name, it's the stupidest part about you. It's just like it doesn't have, you can't define it. And I like the way you like nicknames are okay, because a nickname actually is a way to give you something that's attached to your, and that's why I think objecting to one's nickname makes perfect sense to me. So when I played football in college, and my nickname was Gordo, which if you know you would know that's not a nickname anybody would want, and everybody called me that all the time, and even people that it was given to me
like Spanish Gordo.
Yes, yeah. I mean, although what's odd is that it was the name was so stupid how I got it, but it quickly became like I was fat, right? Like that.
Yeah.
I was a big guy. I was about 230 pounds. So it wasn't inappropriate. But like everyone called me that, even people, like I had even professors that would call me, because it was just so ubiquitous, and I hated it. And so once I got out of college, I made sure that no one ever called me that. But that seems to me to be like, that's the problem. The reason why I hated it was because I thought it had a significance, right? I thought it had a signified, and your name precisely does not have a signified, right? It's just like, there's no, Andrew doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean you're overweight, right? Or you're underweight or anything like that, right?
No, yeah, that's good. Yeah, and that's funny that you said about nicknames, and it's funny because Nick and I kind of like, I guess, came up with my nickname together. But the big sig is just like my slang way of saying the master signifier. So the master sig, the big sig.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
And then
it also has the Freud.
Yeah,
the thing he does on the train, right?
The Signorelli thing. Yeah. Do you have anything, Nick?
I was just thinking about that whole point about semiotic gaps, and yeah, when I was talking to Michael Downs, he helped me clarify a few things, because we were talking about repression, and we were talking about this idea of like there being signifiers in the unconscious, and he quoted you there again about semiotic gaps. Guess there's a semiotic gap here because you maybe don't remember saying it, but it made more sense to me, because it's like we're always at pains to get away from this idea of there being a basement to the unconscious where everything's contained, and it seems to me that there's a lot about, especially the famous aphorism, unconscious is structured like a language, that can lend itself to that. But it feels like there's almost two unconsciouses. Like one would be the symptomal unconscious that appears in slips, bungled actions, whatever, sometimes even just like psychosomatic pain or something like that. And then there's like the unconscious that is reconstructed like a language in analysis. I don't know. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I would maybe say that I guess in analysis you can talk about it, right? You're trying to put what was unconscious into words, but even then, I think Lacan is good on this in Seminar 11, where he talks about this opening and closing of the unconscious, because once you put it into words, you've missed the unconscious, right? I think that's even it doesn't matter where you do it, even in analysis. So I think you're right that you're reconstructing the unconscious, but in doing so, you're missing the unconscious, precisely because the unconscious can only be articulated in the gap or in the slip or in the failure, right? Not in the actual full articulation of something. So I think that distinction does hold, even despite the way that the analytic session would work.
But it's kind of like I was reading Surplus Enjoyment recently, and Slavoj very beautifully describes the unconscious as something, between being and non-being. And I think that's the hardest part to grasp about it, right? Is that it's not just there. It's not this stream of unconsciousness that's just always there and then kind of pops up. It pops up, but then it like does articulate an entire kind of syntax in the moment, but it's not that that's always unfolding beneath the surface either.
Right. No, I think that's a crucial, right? Otherwise, then you get this hidden second layer, this depth that you have to dive down to, and then you come up for air, right? I think that other, I really like that it's neither being nor nothing, but what is produced when nothing becomes something, right? Like, I think that's that there's not just this choice. Like, it's not just when you're not speaking, or when you're not, what you can't make conscious is unconscious. Instead, it's in the act of making something conscious, or in the act of thinking, or in the act of speaking, something doesn't fire, something misses. And I think that's how you have to think of unconscious.
I guess for me, it just makes me wonder then, what is psychoanalysis? To ask an extremely naive question in the sense of, it addresses, as Lacan says, the subject of science,
Right.
the subject of modernity. Maybe you could even go so far as to say the subject of late capitalism.
I think modernity is right.
Yeah.
I think modernity is right.
So then, like, what is in the sense of, like, what emerges from it? Is it something that's almost supposed to, like, in some sense, provide like succor for the individual who is in some sense like deprived of some of the other I would almost say
Like tradition,
ritualistic,
right? Like
traditional
tradition.
outlets,
Yeah. I think that's,
in a sense.
I think that's right. I think the idea is to provide some kind of alternative to the reliance on tradition and I think why it only emerges in modernity is because before you could fall back to some extent or another on that tradition, right? And then in modernity you can't. And so I think that's right, that it doesn't provide you something to fall back on, but I think it helps you get rid of the idea that there could be something to fall back on. So I think that's the thing that you're haunted by in modernity is, wait a minute, and this is what fascism plays on, right? Like, let's wait, we can reinstall, we can go back to and create this world where we'll have some traditions that we can rely on. And then of course there's the utter capitalist who says, no, there's nothing like that can exist. And I think psychoanalysis is between those two positions, because it says, no, we're going to allow you to reconcile yourself to the fact that you're not going to have anything to fall back on. And you're not through capitalist accumulation, you're not going to come with some kind of ersatz version of what tradition did and give you something to rely on in that way. So I think that it's between those two things, but I think it's saying, not providing you a new tradition, but providing you precisely a way to, how do you live without that, trying to get back to that, right?
Right. And this is where like the whole notion of like not only the death of God, but God being unconscious comes into play.
Right.
And why there is no big other, because the other is lacking. And Zizek points this out, and for them, they know not what to do. It's like there is some parallel between the way we could read Christianity, at least his version of Christianity, with psychoanalysis. But the only difference is that psychoanalysis doesn't give you the opportunity to, ignore your ignorance and rely on some big father figure for atonement. You have to have the responsibility to deal with your own loss and lack.
Right. I think that's right. And the idea that you can, like, for like the whole religion, it seems like to me for psychoanalysis, the religious move tries to make, is a way of avoiding that. Like, to say that God is unconscious, which Lacan says is only later in Seminar 11, to say that is to say, okay, even that thing that people seem to rely on in the past, that was already, it never had the status that you might imagine that it once had. So I think that's really, like, it's trying to not, I think if you is even for, so Nietzsche, who in Gay Science famously says God is dead, he nonetheless thinks that we can create something new that will replace that, right? Übermensch or eternal embrace of eternal return. And I think that psychoanalysis wants to say you can't even do that. Like, that's what God is. It's a difference to say God is dead versus unconscious. I think that Lacan was very intentional about that.
Right.
So I've just got one more question for you, Todd,
Sure.
which is like, you know, Lacanians in general have their fixations when it comes to the seminars. It's usually 7, 11, 20, 23, and it's 17 for some people, but like I feel like everybody wants to jump into those seminars and you know, plant their flag somewhere there.
Yeah.
But what do you think is the benefit of reading seminars 1 through 3? Why read them?
I think that I read 1 through 3 very early. Like I think I might have read them 1 and 2 first, like really early. Maybe I read seminar 11. I don't know. But I think there's a real benefit to even reading them first, because I think that you can really see how he moves, for one thing, as we've talked about earlier. But also, I think I said this before, that I don't think you get as good of explanation of how the symbolic order works in the later seminars. I think that the discussion of Purloined Letter seems to me to be one of the great real explanations of how the symbolic structure forces your hand, even no matter what you consciously will. And I think that's to me, I don't think you get that same kind of thing in the later seminars. I think you're right that it's funny, you can tell so much about a person, like the people that we hang out with, by which seminar they stick their flag in, right? Like Maury Rudy, for her, seminar 7 was I would have slipped that was, because I said 11 on a slip, but she would never have said that. Seminar 7 was the seminar. And also and Rick Boothby the same way, like seminar 7 is the one. And then everything else is a flight from that, a failure to really come to terms with that. Whereas for someone like Slavoj, seminar 7 is just a hapax. It just doesn't, it's a one-off. It doesn't fit in the whole thing. And it's much more seminar 11. I feel like there's this sweet spot from, I don't know, seminar 9 to seminar 16, where it's great. And then before I find more valuable in what's before than in what's after, to be honest. Like I think 1, 2, and 3 did more to help me fully understand what Lacan's thought was than anything else I read. So I think that to me, that's the value. Like it's an incredible value. And I think the way, to me, like Name of the Father, that explanation that he gives with that in that, what's it called? Like where he talks about the highways. What does Miller call that chapter? It's like something. Maybe it's about.
We haven't gotten there yet, actually.
Oh, you haven't gotten there yet. Okay,
No.
okay. But it's like the third to last or penultimate chapter of the seminar, and I think that to me, like that gave me the best understanding of Name of the Father. It was better than anything else I read. So that's for me why these. So I think 2 is more valuable than 1. I think 2 is the most valuable of all the ones before, maybe even before 10. Like I really think it's important.
Yeah, 10 I think is pretty good too. Like you get the relation between anxiety and like this is where he actually introduces objet a, right?
Right. I mean, actually, it comes in the identification chapter
9.
before, right? But yeah, it's basically in 10 when it really gets fleshed out. And then it's funny because I think most people much more read 11 than 10. But I tried to teach 10 and it's hard. It's hard. Like 11 is easy. He's going into a popular audience and it's easier. But I think you're right. Like objet a is really getting developed in seminar 10. And also the relationship between it and the experience of anxiety is really so crucial for him. And then he never comes back to that either. So
yeah, that's actually really a good point. Like he doesn't really talk about anxiety much. And if I'm not
it's
mistaken,
gone. Yeah.
you actually get a seminar like 10 with like all 3 clinical structures talked about, right? Or at least
right.
pervert
That's
talked about more. And yeah.
Yeah, I think that's crucial, right? Like and I think it ends with obsession, right? Like there's a really nice discussion of obsession in seminar 10, which he doesn't, I mean, it really gets short shrift in almost all, I mean, for it, I guess, in the analysis of the Wolfman, but I think mostly obsession gets and Ratman too, but so maybe in the case studies, but when he's theorizing, it seems like hysteria really has pride of place for both of them.
I guess we'll have to include a 10
Yeah, 10's a good
on our
one.
list
It's good.
because
Yeah.
we were gonna skip from 3 to 7 just because I don't know, we're mortal. We're not gonna be able to do an episode in every single lecture from every
Yeah, that'd be a lot.
Just
seminar,
come
but-
back, you know.
Yeah, you could come back. I think that's, but 7, it's so singular that I think you kind of have to do that. But I think 10 is pretty great. And then I think I don't know if it's going to be. I think it is going to be translated. But the seminar 14 on the logic of fantasy just came out in French. I think there's a translation schedule. Yeah.
Yes, Bruce Fink's working on it, and Bruce Fink is scheduled to, or already translated seminar 16, and I saw on Amazon it's going to be released in December of this year. So
It's my favorite seminar of all.
Yeah.
I think I'm the only one who plants their flag on seminar 16.
Yeah.
But I think that there's I don't want to talk about that now, but I think there's a real, that the political dimension of Lacan is more evident in that seminar than any other one.
Right. And this is that seminar is called From an Other to the Other, right?
To the Other,
Yeah. And so this is like where we get the whole like set theory, and like where like really that the other, there's no container for language, right? You know?
Right, but it's also the first time he says the term surplus jouissance. So sorry, I just made a terrible mistake, because people say that all the time, surplus jouissance, but Lacan actually, the term he uses is plus de jouir in French. So surplus jouissance is this odd kind of word where people are not translating one part of it, but they are translating surplus. So either you have to say surplus enjoyment, or you have to say plus de jouir, I think. But anyway, it's like that. I think that concept doesn't appear in Psychoanalytic Act, which is 15, and then it emerges in 16.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is one question that I do have about 3, because I'm very confused on how this relates with how the psychotic is really not in language. And when he gives the example of the woman that says, like, encounters the sort of like perverted like neighbor, like I guess like the and it says that I've been to the butcher and Sal, right? That one is still a little confusing to me. I'm like, I get the idea, but like I just don't really get the details on how that applies with psychotic structure or psychosis as a clinical structure.
Can you remind me, is he using that as an example of psychosis?
Yeah, and sort of like paranoid delusions.
Right. So I think it's that, isn't it, that the neighbor doesn't say anything?
Yeah, right? I think so. Or she thinks he says Sal or something.
She thinks he says Sal, right?
Yeah.
Right. I think,
It's French for what?
What's that?
It's French, right? That's like a French term for something.
No, I think that's a translation. I think Sow is a word for pig, right? Like so I think when she says that's what it means. Like, so she says I've been to the butcher, and she thinks she hears him say, like, he makes the connection between butcher shop and you're a big fat pig, you're a sow, you're a big fat pig. And so that's for him. I think that's for Lacan, the delusion in the case. So
okay,
that's she's not only hearing voices, but hearing the voice that insults her, which is tied to this connection between the signifiers, right? Like she connects butcher shop because meat is in the
and charcutier, which is the like in the footnote, handles pork products or something.
Right.
Yeah. Do you have anything else, Nick?
Nothing that comes to mind. I think we covered mostly everything between this and the Y theory episode.
Well, thanks guys. It was great.
Yeah. I hope to do this again when we're finished with 3.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be fun. Yeah. Then all my discussions of the end will actually make sense.
Retroactively.
Yeah, exactly. The little quilts.
Right. All right. Thanks, guys.
Yes.
Take
Thanks
care.
a lot, Todd.
Okay, sure.